All right. Good evening. My name is Hunter, and this is Content Review for Principles of Biology. This week we are doing plant evolution. Sorry if I'm a little bit scattered this evening. Had an errand and was out riding my motorcycle, and it was glorious, and it just took a little bit more of a meandering path than I otherwise would, but that meant that I was a little compressed for time getting ready for you. So, without further ado. Events in plant evolution. Looking first at vascular tissue. Mutations in some land plants gave rise to vascular tissue. So to kind of set the stage here, we've been talking about sort of the progression in types of complexity. Evolution can only work with what already is and then sort of adapts it to meet whatever the new external pressures are. And so, excuse me. So at some point we make this leap from a single-celled organism that is photosynthetic to colonial forms. Cyanobacteria is the one that comes to mind. And then we make this jump onto land at some point. And so this worksheet is really thinking through the steps that had to take place, similar to how we were talking about endosymbiont theory, the steps that had to take place for that to be able to take place. So we have this new oxygen-rich environment that is out of the water. What had to happen for that to take place? So the first question here, mutations in some land plants gave rise to vascular tissue. What advantages did these plants have compared with land plants that did not contain any vascular tissue? I'm going to actually maybe do a little bit of drawing today. Vascular tissue, arteries and veins. When you look at a leaf and you see, wow, that's a new feature. Don't do that. You can see these veins. It has never done this automatically before. That's what we're talking about. These are very analogous to the structures that we enjoy that transport nutrients throughout the system. So the evolution of vascular tissue has a couple advantages. One thing that's new, being out of the water, is we no longer have this buoyant force supporting the body of the plant. So the first thing is it provides some structure to support against gravity. So as a result of this additional support, trees could grow taller, or plants could grow taller. When space was limited, that could be a real advantage as well. You're not in competition with the other plants that are taking up all of that ground cover, which gives you more access to better sunlight. So that structure, just do this as an arrow, that structure leads to taller plants. Access sun when space is limited. And I'm going to write here new niche. Moving into a new niche where there's less competition is one way that organisms can overcome adverse conditions. So as a result of this more access to sun in new niches, these plants could also have higher metabolisms. And these faster rates of metabolism could lead to additional growth, which can give you better height, bigger size. The addition of vascular tissue also allowed for quicker, more efficient transport of water and food throughout the plant. More efficient transportation of nutrients. Yeah, we'll just leave it at nutrients, including food and water. Okay. Yeah, that's the big three. Evolution of roots and leaves. Mutations in some land plants gave rise to roots at the bottom and leaves, or both. What advantages did these plants have compared with plants that did not contain roots or leaves? Roots are really nifty. First things first, let's do a little illustration. Roots and leaves. So roots at the bottom, leaves up top. Roots have a lot of surface area. This increased surface area increases water absorption from the soil, for one. It can also increase well, they don't have this in the answer key, but it is another thing that it offers. We were talking about plants getting taller and being able to, compete for sunlight better against the plants that were just growing, that were short, those shady plants. This evolutionary advantage of the root system further anchors that plant into the soil, not just the topsoil, but into the deeper soil. So it has, again, access to more and different nutrients and also a stronger base so that it can grow even taller. Leaves with vascular tissue, similarly to what we were talking about before, provided both an increase in surface area for photosynthesis, but also transpiration. Transpiration is that evaporation of moisture. As a result, some cells could specialize in functions other than photosynthesis, for example, roots and water absorption. Transpiration is really, really important when it comes to these vascular plants because it's the primary driving force drawing water and nutrients up these tall plants, which I believe we have an exercise about that, or had one last term. Yeah, we were talking about nutrient transport. So that should be a review. All right. The trend toward reduction of the gametophyte generation. So the root word here is gamete, which I don't know how to remember this other than to know that gametes are in animals like us, egg and sperm cells. They are haploid. Haploid cells, meaning they have half the full number of chromosomes that somatic cells would have, soma being the body. Mutations in some land plants gave rise to life cycles in which the gametophyte generation was reduced. What advantages did these plants have compared with plants that did not have reduced gametophyte generation? So reduction and enclosure in particular of the gametophyte generation within the sporophyte. Spores, it's exactly what it sounds like, but sporophytes are typically, well, we'll get into that in a second. Reduction and enclosure of the gametophyte generation within the sporophyte helps protect the reproductive phase from mutations in DNA. Helps protect reproductive phase. Protects against mutations in the DNA, which could be caused by increased amounts of ultraviolet and cosmic radiation, because again, we don't have that water, which is a pretty good insulator against that ultraviolet radiation surrounding us anymore, or surrounding the plants anymore. My U's and my V's look a little too similar. All right. A mutation in a haploid genome is going to show up immediately. Is why this is important. Mutation in a diploid genome, which is what this sporophyte would be. So we've got N, which is haploid. Sporophyte is diploid, 2N. Diploid cells are going to be more resistant to deleterious mutations in their genomes. So, evolution of the seed. Mutations in some land plants gave rise to the seed. What advantages did these plants have compared with plants that did not have seeds? So the seed contains a partially developed 2N diploid. Embryo inside. And this is the product of fertilization of the egg by a sperm from a pollen tube, in the case of plants. Seeds have, so again, that's important for that mutation piece. Seeds also have a food source built into it, which is helpful for early development. You have a protective coating, which is going to protect it from ultraviolet radiation that might cause mutations. It's going to protect it from some predation. It's going to protect it from huge shifts in temperature and moisture and things like that. So it's going to increase the survivability of that reproductive cell. It's also quite expensive, right? This food source, this protective coating, these are all energetically very expensive for the plant to produce. So it's a very different kind of reproductive strategy from what existed before, which could have just been millions and millions and millions of gametophytes released into the environment and a few of them persisting and that being enough. Yeah, and this protective coating, these are often very waxy, which is part of what helps protect against dehydration. The image here is, you can think of seeds as an embryo with a packed lunch and a raincoat, if that helps you. This is sent out into the world to make it on its own. The seed has some additional advantages over a spore. The embryo is already in a more advanced state of development, and the larger food store allows both for longer periods of dormancy and supports the early growth phases of the seedling following germination. And upon germination, the food store in the seed allows it to continue developing roots, stem, leaves, all the things that the plant needs to then start producing more of its own energy. It also extends the range that these plants can fling their offspring, basically. There's a species of giant palm tree, native to Chile, I believe, native to South America, called the Jubea wine palm, because they make wine out of it. And the seeds of these wine palm trees remain dormant for around 80 years, and they have everything that they need to persist for that long, basically in the vacuum of space. So these pods, these seeds, will float across the ocean, carried by oceanic drift, for decades and decades, before landing on remote islands. And so Rapa Nui is the indigenous name for Easter Island. Is the most remote place on the planet to be inhabited by humans, and in the 90s, they discovered root molds of Jubaean wine palms. This place is 3,000 miles from the nearest wine palm, and the Jubaean wine palm was there. It predated human introduction and went extinct, perhaps because of human influence on the island, and also because of those really long germination periods. Come on. No, I don't want to read the news. Okay. How might these events in plant evolution, the 4 that we just went through, be related? For example, which would have had to come first in evolution, which next, and so on? Another way to look at this question is to consider which of these events paved the way or made it possible for the other events to occur. Be sure to state evidence for your proposed evolutionary scheme, and to do this, it is useful to ask yourself questions like, would it have been possible for the seed to evolve without vascular tissue first having evolved, and so on? If yes, how could these have occurred? If no, why not? So, good exercise to do on your own. I can just kind of talk through my thinking on this. There's some good suggestions here. So because roots and leaves contain vascular tissue, vascular tissue had to evolve first, right? That's a pretty easy one. Roots and leaves contain vascular tissue, therefore vasculature came first. When we look at the evolution of the dominance of the sporophyte generation versus evolution of the seed, it's most likely that the sporophyte generation became dominant before the seed evolved. You can think of this a couple of ways. Well, for one, this is supported by fossil evidence. But even if it weren't, this sequence seems pretty logical for the protection of both the gametophyte generation and the subsequent or offspring of or sporophyte generation. And again, it's protection of the gametophyte in the sporophyte generation is less costly than producing that seed, and so you could think of it simply in energetic terms too. So let's see. That was a lot of talking. How do I want to write this? It's likely that sporophyte predates seed. Yeah. Gametophyte generation protected by a sporophyte generation, eventually leading to enhanced protection by seeds. We can look at this combined and also say that because of how energetically expensive seeds are, vasculature likely had to come first to really increase the metabolism of these plants to make that possible. Okay. incorporate the following true observations into your analysis of how the events in plant evolution could be related. In the fossil record, spore evidence and so on, indicates that the first plants on Earth were similar to modern-day bryophytes. And I included it here somewhere. Maybe not. Let me find it. Pretty sure this is a bryophyte. Yeah. You can see a lot of these growing on rocks and gardens all over the Pacific Northwest. They don't have true leaves. They don't have, yeah. Anyways, before I get too distracted, the fossil record indicates the first plants on Earth were similar to modern-day bryophytes. How does this relate to the previous steps? The first plants were very likely to have a dominant gametophyte generation and no vascular tissue, as bryophytes have a dominant gametophyte generation and no vascular tissue. The very large marine brown algae, for example, giant kelp, can grow to lengths of 30 feet or more. These algae have both leaf-like and stem-like structures that are held to the bottom of the sea by a holdfast, which is very analogous to a root structure. When examined microscopically, the algae are found to contain transport vessels that are similar to phlegm in function. Phlegm is a vascular structure in these plants. These giant kelp do not contain any xylem-like vessels, however, nor do they have roots. So this particular observation could be, this provides evidence for the coevolution of transport systems. So different kinds of transport systems evolving kind of at the same time. Coevolution of transport system. So even in the water, there were some advantages to be had by this more efficient nutrient transport. In the ocean, food transport system evolved, phloem, and this allowed organisms such as giant kelp to evolve. With efficient food transport systems, photosynthetic parts of the plant that were nearer to the surface of the water were able to supply food to non-photosynthetic parts, which were not exposed to sufficient light energy. The first land plants with xylem and phloem had no leaves or roots. So this is kind of cool. This observation indicates that there was a selective advantage to having xylem and phloem alone. Phloem alone. So in other words, the addition of xylem and phloem allowed plants to grow taller and excel on land. Xylem enabled water to be transported quickly to regions at a distance from the soil. Some parts of the plant could be shaded and still be fed by supporting sugars from photosynthetic parts. Taller plants were less likely to be shaded, and as a result, were able to gather more energy per unit time. Thus, they all had better survival and reproductive rates than shorter plants did. again, tall plants didn't have to compete for resources as much, and this having these transport mechanisms in place even before leaves and roots evolved, again allowed for those non-photosynthetic parts to be fed in the absence of sunlight, as in shade. Some seedless vascular sporophyte plants do not release megaspores. Instead, the megaspore divides on the sporophyte in the old sporangium to produce the female gametophyte. This female gametophyte produces eggs in archegonia, which are fertilized by sperm produced in the antheridia of this or other plants. Neither the female gametophyte once formed nor the developing embryo receives nutrients from the old sporophyte plant. That was a mouthful. This observation allows us to recognize how the stage could have been set for evolution of a seed. And sets the stage for evolution of a seed containing the offspring sporophyte that was dependent on the parent sporophyte plant. Sets the stage for the evolution of seeds containing the offspring sporophyte. That was dependent on the parent sporophyte plant. Write an analysis. I'm probably not going to do this. So each change in evolution really builds on what already exists. You can't really get sort of spontaneous creation from nothing, and that's why some of these processes, it's not the most optimal thing. It's just what was optimal enough for the organism to persist. So, in the previous observations, how did they? Yeah, I mean, I think it should be fairly straightforward at this point. Like, you need vascular tissue to be able to feed parts of the plant that aren't actively photosynthesizing. This increase in metabolism allows for the subspecialization of structures like leaves and roots, which increase surface area, which allows for more better metabolic output and more diversity and more specialization. You get taller plants, you get bigger plants, moving into new niches, eventually having enough excess energy to start putting that into seeds for more successful reproductive strategies, on and on. And plants get really wild. When we think about coevolution, plants producing flowers that look like the insects that pollinate them, that happening over millions of generations of specialization and evolution of those species inhabiting the same ecosystem, and their mutual success sort of supporting each other, right? It gets wildly complex, but it's a pretty simple mechanism. All right. Some true or false questions. Come on. Consider a puddle of water in which mosses, ferns, and an angiosperm are growing. In a drop of water taken from the puddle, you observe flagellated sperm. Which of the following statements concerning the sperm could be true and which are definitely false? Consider each statement separately and explain your answers. So first, let's look at the problem. We have mosses, we have ferns, we have Angiosperms. Angiosperm, I believe, just means that it produces seeds, which might be a hint. So true or false, the sperm could have been produced by an antheridium on the moss sporophyte. This is false. Moss sporophytes produce spores. Antheridia produce sperm on moss gametophytes. This is actually the key. Let's see. Moss sporophyte produce spores. Antheridia produce sperm in or on moss gametophytes. So the key word to know here is sporophyte and what produces what. The sperm could later stop swimming and develop into the male gametophyte of the fern. This is also false. The male gametophyte is formed following germination of a spore. Male gametophyte formed following Am I looking at the wrong one here? Germination of a spore. The male gametophyte produces the male gamete or sperm. Okay. True or false? The sperm may be swimming to the archegonium of the fern. This one could be true. Sperm from the antheridia of fern gametophytes fertilize the egg in the archegonium to produce the diploid sporophyte. Fertilize egg in the archegonium to produce the diploid sporophyte. And finally, the sperm could have been released by a pollen tube of an angiosperm. This is false. No known angiosperms produce flagellated sperm. This may have been true at one point for some of the more primitive seed plants, like cycads. I'm going to put this off to the side. Okay. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Stay safe. Enjoy the sun if you can. And I will see you all next week.